everyone. Alrighty, let's go ahead and get into, I guess, module 3 at this point, and let's start talking about food and beverage. So I'm going to try to break this up into a few different videos. First is going to be on beverages, so the next one's going to be on restaurants, and the next one's going to be on managed service. So kind of how does the management perspective of all of this go? So first off, beverages. So in the hospitality industry, the most common thing that people associate with hospitality industries are probably bars, restaurants, lounges, stuff like that. So we're going to talk a lot about sort of the history of differences of wine, beer, and spirits. And these are often paired with food to be able to set a mood for different events or experiences. I am also aware that this might be a tough subject for some of us. The hospitality industry in general has a huge substance abuse problem. And it's just always good to stay wary of that. So I just wanted to give a warning on like what the content's going to be, as we are going to be talking about wine, beer, and spirits for this video. If that's something that you're not interested in, you can jump over to the next video. But just remember that there is a 24/7, 365-day-a-week hotline, 1-800-662-4357, and the legal drinking age in West Virginia is 21. Okay, now that we're past that, if you're wanting to continue on with us, so let's go ahead and start talking a little bit about wine. So what is wine? Wine is fermented juices, right, of rather fresh grapes that have been collected, and the sugar from these different fruits are most commonly grapes, but it can be blackberries, cherries, or other fruits that are very sugar producing, can be used to create wine through the introduction of yeast and other means. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And wines are often categorized or referred to by color, such as red wines or white wines or rosés. And the difference a lot of the time is just if it was fermented with the skins on. So your red wines are ones in which they were fermented with grape skins on, white ones were not. All right, so there's lots of different types of wines that we're talking about. So there's like light beverage wines, sparkling wines, fortified wines, aromatic wines, and oh my gosh, we have so much to learn on that, right? So sort of a brief overview, the winemaking process, we have records of the recipes of how to be able to make and ferment wine for nearly 7,000 years. And it was probably likely made before then. It's just written records only go back so far, right? Or ones that we can even understand or translate. So because the wines were often young and very acidic, they were often flavored with different things, such as like spices or honeys. That's why a lot of these original wines were very mead focused, or had a lot of very heavy spice content to it, right? So these early wines also had very low alcohol volumes. So the reason why you would drink fermented juice as opposed to water in the turn of the millennium, right? So let's think about the BC era and then up until about 1300 AD. Well, in a lot of this time, wine was a safer option, right? So most water sources in different places might have been polluted. They might have had too high of salt content. They may not have been safe to drink. Fermented juices were a way in which there was a safe drinking option available, which is why lots of people did drink wine as opposed to water from some sources before there was modern cleaning techniques, right? We can think all the way back to like the cholera outbreak, because just water sources had huge contamination issues up until we had some of the processes that we have today of cleaning water in I guess 1350 and onwards, right? So because this was supposed to be just something safe to drink, a lot of the time it had very low alcohol volume. Also, we didn't have corking technology yet. So yes, you could fortify your wine, or you could be able to have this sort of fermentation process, but storing it was really difficult. Corking technology that like allowed some amount of release in between oxygen and carbon dioxide didn't necessarily exist in these time periods. So you weren't able to continue fermenting that wine within a bottle. You weren't able to store it. So alcohol volumes were about 2% in wine for a majority of human history up until about the 1350s when we started to get corking technologies. And then it went up to about 14 to 15%. So we have a lot of these oldest records from Egyptians and Babylonians, who were the first to actually sort of like write down these records and preserve them to the point where we're able to look at them today. So the quality of wine depends on many different factors, right? There might be the type of grape, the type of soil, the climate that it's in. If there was a fire, actually that ends up completely drastically changing the taste of wine for tens of years afterwards. The skill and process of the winemaker, the vineyard, and the method of the winemaking and storage. So there's a couple different types of unique wines, right? So one that you might think of is sparkling wines. They're the ones with like the little bubbles. These can be champagnes, though champagne has to come from the Champagne region in France. It could be other types of sparkling wines. So basically any sort of wine that has CO2 in it, right? And sometimes nitrogen, that's something that's become like more recent, is having nitrogen bubbles because you can get more of them and they're really teeny. But wine that contains CO2. So these are kind of interesting, and they rose to prominence in about the 17th century because in about the 150 years before we ended up having the French Revolution, there was this huge push into like nobility having these fancy and best aloof things. Which when we got to an economic downturn later, it ended up not being very popular with the people of France, and then we got the French Revolution. But during this nobility era, a lot of the things that they had were stuff not commonly available to the public, such as sparkling wines, because having a CO2 infused drink, very, very, very difficult to get a hold of at this time and very expensive to process. We also have fortified wines. So these are wines that have a much higher alcohol content because they've had other things such as strong alcohols or brandy added during its process of being made. And these are things such as sherries, ports, marsalas. And then we have aromatic wines. So these are ones that have very, very strong smells and taste to them because they're flavored with herbs, roots, flowers, and other types of barks. These can range from everything from very, very sweet to very, very dry. Let's just say dry, not dry. It's fine. These are mostly so I know kind of where we're going. Now, wine changes a lot by growing region, right? So a lot of old world wines. So a lot of the time you'll hear people in wine start talking about new world wines versus old world wines. Old world wines typically come from parts of Europe that have been doing this for nearly 1,000 years, right? So Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, France. And France is very notable because they have the Champagne and Cognac regions, which are two name brands that you have all around the world, or process types because they are grapes from those particular regions. So many high-end wines, and this is kind of the difference, right? So that's a lot of what we need to talk about in hospitality is sort of how can you tell the difference between low end and high end wines and kind of what is the process there. So as you get to better wine, right? So you have low end wines. These are typically ones who will say that they are a blend of something. They don't have a specific year because they might have grapes from multiple years within it. And they're made from sort of low end quality that might have different types of wines from different regions sort of splashed together, right? As you get closer to the high end, then you start having maybe 1 year or one region, or maybe even a specific village within that region. And the more specific the label starts to get when it comes to things such as like the village or winery that they're produced in, this is when we start getting to more high-end wines, right? So a lot of this we'll be able to see on labels because of the rules that we have related to labeling in the United States when wine is imported in, but the same requirements doesn't necessarily affect US manufacturers because we have different labeling for anything that's made domestically, right? So fun fact, every state has at least one vineyard. There's 24 in Alaska. I think the one with the highest amount of wine per capita is Vermont. And West Virginia, I think, has 40 or so vineyards in West Virginia. California is definitely the powerhouse of American wine, and the sort of like California and Oregon region is divided into North and Central coastal regions, the Great Central Valley region, Southern California region, and places like Napa and Sonoma are major centers of it. So these are places that might produce much higher end wine and have been doing it for a longer period of time so that their grapes are more established and they have more long-term grapes, because some grapes from higher end wines can take 10, 15, 30 years to be able to process in the soil, as opposed to some of like the cheaper wines might have grapes that you can grow relatively frequently in a year or two. So in hospitality, we tend to think about how do we recommend wines, right? Because a lot of the hospitality industry is in fine dining, and a lot of it is trying to pair different types of foods with different types of wines. While I'm not going to go super deep into all of that here because there's a lot to learn. And if you are actually interested in knowing a lot more about wine beyond what you hear here, there's a movie called Somm, SOMM, that kind of goes through the sommelier training. So being a sommelier is that someone in the hospitality industry that they have made studying wine their thing. Right. And they spend years and years mastering it to the point where they can taste wines and know exactly what region they're from, or the different taste pieces that went into it, and being able to understand the nuances of each of these different types of places and be able to perfectly pair that with food and other things. That's a sommelier. A masterclass sommelier, there's only a few of them in the US. And by a few, I mean probably less than 100. Most of them end up being importers of wine, or they might run their own vineyards, or they might be working in just 3-star and above restaurants. So there's only 4 states in the US that have a 3-star or above restaurant, and these are the ones that tend to employ a sommelier on staff who are able to talk about the different recommendations for food and wine. Now, there are lower levels of sommelier. You have your intro sommelier exam, which you can, honestly, a bunch of my friends did in the hospitality program while I was an undergrad, because it was just a lot of fun. And it was a neat and interesting way to be able to learn about wine. But getting up to that masterclass sommelier is a difficult and long journey. So if you're wanting more information, I would definitely go look in those different sorts of places, because if this is something you're interested in, there's a lot of resources out there that can go through sort of the history of wines and studying wine for a living. But I'm going to give you the very, very basics. In between red wines and white wines tend to go with lighter meats. So fish, chicken, tofu and veggies, things that tend to be a little bit lighter are white sauces, while red wines tend to go with beef, pork, and many other heavier meats, which are paired with these sort of like deeper, robust red wines. Basically, kind of the spectrum that we have is the heavier the meal, the more robust the wine. Now, the extremely sweet wines, these tend to be held for dessert, and these might be your ports or your rosés. Okay. So there's many places that produce wine in the world, right? These are just sort of the powerhouses, but pretty much every country has some sort of vineyard there. But we have a lot of big, bold reds coming from Chile and Argentina. We have many of the most famous old style white and red wine being produced all throughout both Western and Eastern Europe. So we also have some from Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, Turkey that are very good wines. And then Ukraine actually has a lot of vineyards that aren't producing as much right now, but their imports are pretty good. Anyways, and then we have, let's see, some of the darker red wines and lighter white wines that come from Russia. We also have some extremely sweet wines that come from this area. We have more of the fermented style wines or fortified wines that are created in like South Korea, Japan, and China. Australia is really known for white wines, and so is New Zealand. So this is where you get a lot of your different Sauv Blancs from. And the US is kind of a mix of everything. And I think it's because we have so many different regions and climates, right? Different types of winemaking processes really depend on what your latitude or longitude is. It turns out that grapes love cold, but they don't love super cold, right? So having sort of this balance in between, is this something that is grown in a very hot, humid environment, or is this something grown in more of a colder environment, can completely change the taste of the wine, which means it would completely change how we would pair that wine, right? So countries differ in their labeling requirements. For example, most South American countries and old world wines, they have specific packaging requirements. Like if you are going to export out that wine, you need to have the comptroller who is in charge of it. You need to be able to have a lot of information about the exact vineyard that it came from, because this is information that's produced on the label, and it's a way of being able to kind of say that it's this one specific thing. For example, you can't just call any sparkling wine champagne. It has to come from the Champagne region in France, right? So the labels from that area, the government actually has a system in France where they test to make sure that this is a very high quality champagne wine. Then what they do is they say that it has been certified by the comptroller, especially for its quality. And then when it's exported out, you'll know what level of quality and what percentage of this wine comes from champagne, because of the different things on this label. In the US, our labels tend to be a little different because we don't have to have all this import or export information. So we tend to just have things that are labeled by the varietal grape or sort of the name of the region. So if it's like a Napa wine, or if it's a Simona wine, right? Organic wines tend to have their own label too. So for example, let's look here. On international labels. So these are things that have been imported in. We'll see a couple different things, right? A lot of time we'll have, for example, the name of the city or vineyard. Then we're going to have, see this says D origin. Oh my God, I'm gonna screw this up. Origine Controlla. Anyways, this is the name of the comptroller for Italy, which means that this is a certified Italian wine that has at least 50 or 85% of a particular type of grape, whatever the requirements is for this particular wine. Then we see that we have a year. So if there's not a year printed, it's typically because it's a blend of wine from multiple years. If there is a year printed, this means, okay, well, all of these grapes we know are from this one year. That's really important because we can judge a lot by what weather was happening at that time. So if it was an extremely rainy season, you might have a sweeter wine. If they were going through in those years a period of a drought, it might be a much drier wine, right? We also have what this lot number is. So this tells us a lot about the import. So how big they are, what lot it was. So if this wine went bad, they would know to be able to go look at all the other ones. We have that this is a product of Italy, information about the alcohol volume and how much of the volume was within the bottle. So a typical bottle of wine is 750 milliliters. Things that you don't see here that will actually be on the back of the wine label is you will have someone listed as an importer. So a lot of the time, grocery stores or different wine shops like your Total Wine or your neighborhood supermarket, they don't travel around the world to pick their favorite wines, right? That would be exhausting. What they instead do is they partner with either an import company or there might be an individual who goes around the world. This is typically your masterclass sommeliers who work in wine imports, and they go taste wines from everywhere and they come up with a special designated list where they're like, these are the ones that I would like to import. I think that these are the absolute best. And then the different grocery stores or whoever is partnered with them will end up importing based upon what that information is. So this is kind of what happens with our international labels, right? Instead, in the US market, so in the US market, because we're not actually having to import anything, you don't have a listed importer. You might have a listed bottler. So for example, here in this US one, we see 2018. Okay, so this would be a wine from one particular year. We see Napa Valley. So Napa Valley means that majority of the grapes that are within this wine, if not all, so I think there's a certain percentage it has to be over, have come from this particular region. Now notice it doesn't say a particular vineyard, so it might mean that there's multiple vineyards or multiple places within Napa Valley that have combined their wine from that season to be able to make this wine. Another way that we might know that this is a combined wine from multiple places is because it says red wine here. If you have a high percentage of a particular type of grape, such as a Merlot grape or a Pinot Grigio grape or something like this, then you would have it listed by what that one particular type is. If it says red wine or red blend or table red, a lot of this means that it's different types of red wines put together. Does that mean it's bad? No, that just means that it's a different flavor profile that's based upon different things. Now, this is why it sometimes gets a very bad reputation, is because a lot of the time this is something that very low-end producers do. For example, the wine that's like $3 at Aldi or Trader Joe's, a lot of the time that's just the worst wines from multiple vineyards all kind of smashed together and put into a bottle, right? And that's something that's used very often. That's why a lot of the time these tend to be labeled as red wine, white wine, or just something very vague that doesn't have a specific region listed or sometimes not even a specific year listed. But there are high-end producers who also do this, who might say, hey, we know that there's this type of meal out there, and we want to create the perfect wine for this meal. And maybe the perfect wine for this meal is a 25% Chardonnay grape and a 50% Sauv Blanc grape and a 25% Pinot Grigio grape all put together. So in those cases, it's a strategy sometimes used by high-end manufacturers for specific purposes, or something that's more common among low-tier manufacturers, which is why having just like red wine or white wine listed has gotten a bad reputation, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Now, in the international labels, we'll have an importer. In the domestic ones, we tend to have a bottled by. So in this one, it's saying like, the Prisoner Wine Company, Oakville, California. Okay, cool. Now we know who has actually put that wine within the bottle. So a lot of the times you'll have wine or grapes from different regions or from different places. Oh no, did I mess this up? All right, you might have wine from different places that are then transported and bottled elsewhere or bottled by a third party, which means that gives you a little bit of information about, are they doing this in-house? For example, this company is bottling their own wine. Is it something that they instead send out to a third party? This can tell us a lot about maybe the quality or about what sort of information that wine has gone through, right? So we also have the alcohol percentage by volume and then how many milliliters. We also have this piece called contains sulfites, right? So all of your wine will either have sulfites or not have sulfites. This is just a part of the different processes that deals with yeast production, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I am not a winemaker. I don't understand all the individual nuances there, but it's something that a lot of people might get really flushed if it's within their wine. So it might be something that if certain individuals might choose not to have within their wine. If it's an organic wine that has been certified as organic, which we've had from the USDA since I think like 1986. So using different sort of environmentally friendly methods of producing your wine that doesn't use chemicals or pesticides, then you might have an individual green stamp somewhere on the label if the vineyard chooses to use that stamp. A lot that have the rights to use the stamp don't always want to use it, but many do because it's a way of showing off that they do have sustainable and holistic practices. Okay, so that's a little bit about wine. If you want to know more about wine, and this is just something you're interested in studying, please let me know, and I can refer you to a bunch of really good textbooks on like the history of wine and the regions of wines that are used in some of our culinary classes, because we do have specific culinary classes geared towards understanding the history and the nuances and differences in wine. That's kind of neat. All right, let's think about beer. All right, so beer is brewed, right? So wine you might have in an open cask or in a closed cask, but a lot of it is just a process of fermenting grapes and then going through a process of getting it ready to ferment either within a container or within a bottle, and then it goes out. Or if it's a lambic, like an open air container, which is weirdly both a weird wine and beer. That's a whole other story. Anyways, beer is instead brewed, right? So this is something that goes through a process where it's heated up very rapidly and then cooled down over a period of time, where we then add in a lot of different elements to it, which would give it different types of flavor. And then we bottle it, right? So it's a brewed and fermented beverage made instead of fermenting grapes from fermenting barley or other starches. So this is actually, you'll hear every now and then, if you're a history buff, you'll hear something called the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws was different import taxes, not really on corn. It was on lots of different cereal type products. So it was on wheat, it was on barley, it was on different types of grains, it was on everything else. And a lot of this was actually during the production of beer. And then we had it very strongly, or these corn laws very strongly within Great Britain and the United States and Canada. The United States got rid of it first, and then Britain, and then I think eventually Canada after that. And these corn laws were meant to be able to protect domestic farmers from having cheaper imports coming in from elsewhere that didn't always necessarily serve that purpose and might have made it so that you weren't able to actually get enough supplies to be able to make things such as like bread and beer. But beer is brewed from these different sort of cereals and starches, and then flavored with hops later on in the process. So beer is a very generic term. Basically, it's just a variety of different mash-based and yeast-fermented brewed malt beverages. Like, that's the widest umbrella that we could possibly give it, and there's lots of things that go within that. Typically, beers have a alcohol content in between 3.8 and 8%, so it's actually going to be about half or a fourth, so in between a half and a fourth of the alcohol per volume of wine. And most of the time, it stays within this range. Now, this doesn't mean it has to. We know that there are a bunch of stronger beers that go beyond a certain percentage, which means that you can't sell it legally within some states. Like Utah has a cap on how much the ABV for your beer could be. But I think the strongest currently producing beer is from Sam Adams, and it's like 24%. And there's actually a lot of discussion, is this technically a beer because it's such a high alcohol percentage? So the term beer may refer to different things such as like lagers, ale, stouts, pilsners, and these refer to the different brewing processes. So from a very just academic perspective, let's talk about sort of the brewing process of beer. So beer is brewed using water, malt, yeast, and hops. So water is by far the largest part of the beer, right? Out of each beer that is produced, about 85 to 89% of that finished product is going to be water. So at first, we have this large volume of water. Grain is added in sort of a malt form. What malt means is just mean that the barley and other cereals have been ground into a really, really small grit, added to the water. We allow the grain to germinate, which produces enzymes. So this enzyme allows it so that the starch that we have from these different grains can be turned into fermentable sugar, which that sugar is what the yeast eats, right? And then the yeast ends up producing different things such as alcohol. So the grain is then mashed into malt. to give it sort of this like stickiness to it, right? And this malt goes through a hopper and then to a mash tub. Basically, what that means is that it is heated up and ground down and multiple things to essentially make like a slurry, right? So the water and grains are sort of like mixed together to make this sort of slurry, which we call a wort, which is heated up. It's absolutely boiled, and the amount of time that it's boiled can actually change what type of beer that you have. And this is then filtered through to get out any sort of impurities. So the liquid sort of flows into a brewing kettle at that point, which is still very hot. And then hops are added, and this mixture is boiled for several hours, and then yeast is added, and the liquid or yeast is added to be able to eat those sugars and to produce alcohol within this process. And then we start to go through the fermentation process. Now, then it can sit anywhere from a couple days or a couple weeks to months. It depends on like what this particular brewing process is, but eventually we get to the bottling process. So that's a lot, right? There's lots of different steps. And honestly, if you want to learn some of this cool stuff, if you are 21 or above 21, or you eventually are above 21 after 21, most smaller breweries will give tours, and they can give you some really cool information about how each of the different steps and processes work. For example, or not even only the small ones. So for example, if you go down to Atlanta, Sweetwater Brewery has a really great tour that will show you what each single part of the process does and how it all works together. Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis also has a really great tour where they take you through and they teach you the science behind the process. So, and those are always kind of free to do, and they're lots of fun. So breweries typically have their own cultured yeast. So a lot of the taste of a beer is determined by what sort of yeast you're putting into it and what sort of hops you're putting into it. So brewers tend to have like their preferred yeast, and yeast can multiply, right? So it's something that once you have a typical culture that you like, you can continue to produce it for a long period of time. A couple other things to just know about this is like mashing is a term for sort of like grinding that malt and screening it out. And organic beers, this is a newer sort of product that we've had since 1997, where we've been able to start certifying some beers as organic, the National Organic Program. These are just ones that are using particularly holistic and safer techniques that do not have sort of like pesticides when producing malts and stuff like that. So that's a little bit about the brewing process, which I think is kind of fun and interesting to know about. So we have wine, we have beer, and these are two things that we love pairing with different sorts of meals or different sorts of events to be able to create an ambiance or a mood. But we also have spirits. So while wine and beer are more commonly drank along with dinner, spirits is a liquor, right? So a spirit or liquor is made from different liquids, which has just been fermented and distilled. So instead of brewed, where we have it going through this process where we're boiling it for long periods of time, we instead have distilled, which is using a more confined containment system, which produces large levels of alcohol, but does not have eventual like CO2 put into it, right? Fermentation ends up taking place by the action of yeast on the sugar-containing substances such as the grain or fruit. So many different liquors can be made from strawberries, blackberries, any sort of stone fruit, things like that. But most often they're made from different sort of starch-based products, such as wheat, such as rye, such as potatoes, right? So the level of alcohol that's within these spirits, because they typically are much higher volume alcohol than what we have in wine or beer, these are denoted by something called a proof. So you might hear that an alcohol is 60 proof, 70 proof, 80 proof. That's just whatever the percentage of alcohol in that is multiplied by 2. So if you have something that's at 35% alcohol within your container, then that's a 70 proof piece of alcohol, whichever it is, right? So spirits are usually consumed before or after a meal. So while beer and wine are consumed during a meal, and we really like to pair that together with different pieces, the role of spirits in the hospitality industry is for the purpose of either trying to set a tone before a mood, or to be able to stimulate appetite before a mood, or for like a celebration or things afterwards, as in closing the night. So these may be served straight. Some people drink liquor straight, or they might be mixed with water, soda water, juices, cocktail mixes, a whole bunch of different stuff. I'm sure many of you know all the information that I'm saying, but for lots of us, this is sort of our like first time in sort of thinking about things. So there are many different types of spirits, right? We have, oh gosh, so many. We have whiskeys, we have bourbons, which are actually just a notion of whiskey. We have vodkas, we have tequilas, we have lots of different types of alcoholic beverages, which can be combined in different ways to be able to produce different flavor profiles, which might go along with your event. So whiskey is a very generic name for a type of spirit that was originally distilled in Scotland and Ireland. Now, not all types of whiskey now are designated in Scotland and Ireland, but that's where the first original process came from. And this is typically made from a fermented mash of grain and some sort of barley, which is added into it. Except when it comes to bourbon, then it specifically has to be rye. That's a whole other mess. So these are naturally white or pale in color when first produced. And lots of people don't know that because most whiskey bottles, they seem very dark and ambery. But they are naturally white or pale when they're first produced. The color that comes from it, so the sort of like darkening and browning of the whiskey, comes from how it is stored in charred oak barrels. So there are these giant barrels that you end up creating a fire in the middle of it and allowing the entire inside to char. This is not only good for the purpose of flavoring, but it's also good for the purpose of like making sure that you have like a really good seal within that barrel. And then you put your alcohol in there and allow it to store for a long period of time. Now, this might be much longer than you would see in wines and beers. Beers typically take a few weeks to a few months to produce. Wine might take upwards of a year to produce. Whiskey, on the other hand, could sit in barrels for on average 3 to 5 years for most places that are distilling this, but sometimes as long as 12 or 15 years. There's even a couple out there that are 21 years that are typically all overrated and not really worth the price. But to achieve the quality and distinctive taste, whiskeys are blended according to the recipe of the distillery. So that's why they have consistent tasting over time. Now, there's lots of different things that fall under the whiskey umbrella. So we have scotches, which these are typically a lighter type of whiskey that has a very strong, almost smoky type taste to it. We have Irish whiskeys, we have bourbons, which are made specifically within Kentucky, or we have Canadian whiskeys, which are made specifically within Canada. And each of those have their own little nuances of how this process has to go, what sort of water that it has to use in the process, what sort of additives that it has to use in the process. All right. Then we have just kind of an entire series of white spirits. So white spirits are just basically things that might look clear or pale and are very common throughout North America in their use. So while there's many types of white spirits, the most common pieces are gin, vodka, rum, and tequila, right? So each has their own sort of primary flavor, which comes along from their own primary additive. For example, gin's is juniper berries. Juniper berries are used within the gin process to be able to have the sugars that the yeast are going to be able to eat and produce from. And that allows to have a very specific taste that's denoted into gin. And there's many different types of things like this, depending on what kind of alcohol we're talking about. Now, these sorts of white spirits were widely produced in the US during Prohibition. So a lot of it was sort of illegally produced at this time. This is where you have all the stories of the moonshine runners, right? People who would make moonshine in their bathtub and then run them across state lines. Or you would have beer produced in some part of Colorado where it was allowed to, but it wasn't allowed in other parts of southern states so that people would be able to bring some of it down. During this time, this is where a lot of very high alcohol content spirits became popularized in the United States because it was something small and easier to transport that could be hidden during Prohibition when alcohol wasn't necessarily allowed, unless it was prescribed by a doctor, which is a whole other thing. For example, some very high volume alcohols are actually these things called, oh no, what are they called? Bitters. So bitters are something that has typically had an extremely high proof alcohol that has allowed something to sit in it for a long period of time. So most bitters are made from having, you can have sage leaves, you can have different types of bark, you can have different sorts of things sitting in a very high proof alcohol for a very long period of time until it starts to infuse those flavors. This would be under aromatic spirits. Those were some of the few that they would give large prescriptions to, so that people could have shots of this extremely high volume alcohol during Prohibition because it was doctor prescribed, depending on what state you were. There's an entire thing in Michigan where they have an entire parade and system for this to this day. But anyway, so Prohibition ended, but the popularization of sort of these cocktails or things that are drinks that are these white spirit based maintain their popularity, and they still are fairly popular today. Okay, they're very popular today. Now, so we talked a little bit about gin, which is juniper berry based. Then we also have rum. So rums can either be light or dark, but they still fall under this white spirit category because most of the time they actually have this lighter clear or pale coloring. So the difference between light and dark rum is just that light rum is distilled with fermented juices of different sugarcane trees. So that's where they get their sugar content from. While dark rum is distilled with molasses. So that's what gives it its very like a dark coloration to it. These primarily come from Caribbean islands such as Barbados, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and these sorts of island nations, which were huge sugarcane producers for long periods of history. Now, on the other hand, we have things such as like tequila. Tequila, to be certified as tequila, has to come from agave tequiliana, which is a different type of cactus, and it has to be distilled using this. So it might be white, silver, or golden color. Now, the percentage of it that has to be distilled from this cactus plant differs depending on if you're in Mexico, where the native plant is, or if you're in the United States or other places that produce tequila. Because the United States, I think the requirement for it to be called a tequila is it has to just be 51%, while in Mexico it has to be closer to 100% distilled with this cactus. There's lots of other different types of spirits. So for example, brandy is distilled with wine. This is one that we talked about earlier because it can count as both kind of a liqueur and a wine, and it's just a very high alcohol volume wine tasting liqueur, right? The most famous of this is cognac. Cognac is actually a region in France, and the best brandy in the world tends to be from there. And it can only be called cognac if it comes from this one particular region in France. If not, you cannot call it. If you wonder why we stick so strongly to the champagne and cognac designation, it's because France is very litigious and they will sue you. So many other different types of specialized alcohol might have a particular region that they come from, and then other places might imitate it by saying like, oh, I produce my champagne-like beverage, and start to give that out to people with that sort of terminology on the label. Most countries are just like, okay, well, that's fine. France is not. France will sue anybody in the world for the purpose of if they infringe upon the labelings of their particular regions, which is why we have such a strict naming convention for things such as champagne and cognac. So spirits and cocktails, or spirits, don't only have to be drank alone. Most of the time they're actually put into cocktails. Now, cocktails have been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's something that we've had for honestly probably thousands of years. But some of the first written recipe booklets pertaining to cocktails and how to make cocktails actually came around during the Dark Ages and Enlightenment periods of England. At this time, there were lots of people of the church who actually were working with spirits and cocktails very, very frequently, or different alcohols very frequently, who developed a lot of these initial recipes, put them into booklets, because this is actually where a majority of our written records from this time period come from. And that's how it's persisted to this day. Now, were these things that were at your everyday party? Probably not. They didn't get their popularization until we get up until like the mid 1800s. So after we had the different revolutions and the French Revolution, the American Revolution, we ended up having lots of things happening in Britain at the time. The rest of the world ended up having much higher connection through having trade routes being established and being able to finally make it so that we could start to move these different things all around the world, right? So instead of your alcohol going bad or your alcohol getting lost, or we were able to actually transport it at the right temperatures in reasonable amounts of time. So all of a sudden people were very connected, right? So starting in like the mid 1860s, we started to get some of the popularization of cocktails as showing up at parties. A lot related to the 1880s. This is where we started to have some of our initial pushes into alcohol having more of a place in the household when it comes to cocktail-based products. Then we get into the post-World War I era, where there was lots of celebration. So when we get to the 1920s and the 1930 eras, notice we think about like the Roaring Twenties. This is when we started to have a lot of the popularization of cocktails being a party drink, right? And in the hospitality industry, this sort of history is very important to us because it shows us where we have some of our original recipes that we write from. And it shows us where we have some of these original thoughts and ideas on how this was used in a social setting. So in hospitality, cocktails are used to stimulate appetite or provide an ending to a meal. It's not typically drank within the meal. So when we're thinking about how we pair different foods and drinks as hospitality experts, this is something that we try to keep in mind. All right, and then we have non-alcoholic drinks. So these are ones who have become much more popular recently, right? So non-alcoholic beverages have increased in popularity, especially as we've had a lot of push for healthier lifestyles, and there's been organizations such as like Mothers Against Drug Driving that have raised some of the awareness of dangers related to alcoholic beverages. So this is where we started to see more of a rise of in social settings having non-alcoholic options, right? So a lot of the time now they have completely alcohol-free wines, which are popular in Japan, America, and basically nowhere else. Right now they're actually having a huge push in Europe to be able to try to popularize some of these things, but it's not taking on very well. There's a really good documentary about it if anybody's interested on like Business Insider. So we've had lots of this rise of sort of like non-alcoholic beverages, not just being your water and Coca-Cola, right? It's starting to be, oh, well, let's create a craft cocktail, or let's create something that has the alluring appeal of a wine at a dinner setting, but doesn't actually have the alcohol content. These can be caffeinated, carbonated, plain, or fancy. We'll talk about what that is. So they're used sort of in hospitality. Well, if we're going to talk about non-alcoholic beverages used in hospitality, the powerhouse is coffee and tea, right? So this is where a majority of social drinking tends to happen is in coffee houses all around the world. There's nearly 17,400 coffee houses in the United States. There's much more globally, and the sales of specialty coffees exceed nearly $4 billion, dollars in the United States every single year. Coffee originally came from Ethiopia and what is now known as the Yemen Republic, but it quickly spread around the entire world, right? It was something that could be produced. It provided this caffeinated perspective and had both good and bad reputations over time. Lots of places saw this as like, hey, this is a wonderful thing to be able to work, while other places were like, this is going to cause people to run out into the streets and be wild and merry, and we can't have that. Which is where we have a lot of the stigmatism that comes from coffee and tea. So eventually, coffee became a very important social beverage in the European middle and upper classes, and there are still many cultures where coffee is an inappropriate drink. But there are a lot of places where it's much more popularized, and it's something where it can be a social setting, like going to a coffee shop to be able to talk to individuals. Today, where coffee has been produced has kind of shifted. A majority of coffee is actually produced in Brazil. A lot of it's produced throughout the 54 nations of Africa. And I think that's like really interesting to know where these different products come from. So despite the fact that coffee is huge, tea is still the most drank beverage in the world, to the point where the power grids within the United Kingdom had to readjust how they have to do different sort of optimization of loads, because it turns out that like after soccer matches, everybody would go and turn on their tea kettle, and everybody going and turning on their tea kettle at once would blow the power lines in the United Kingdom on a regular basis. Now, this is something that they always have to bring in and talk about and think about when producing these things. And I just think that that's really just funny. Tea has been around for thousands of years. Some of the oldest dynasties in China were the original developers of tea. We have tea as it spread throughout India and different parts of Asia, and then it eventually got traded throughout Europe and Africa, and then eventually came over to North America. Eventually we had like a tea party where people didn't really get along with the taxes on tea. And here's a lot of the reason why people weren't very happy with the taxes on tea in the United States. Why did we have the Boston Tea Party? So you're like, oh, they taxed tea. Who cares? Because that was the drink that everybody drank. It was a place that was very, teas or tea houses were so important to being able to go pay your bills, to be able to go have social functions, to be able to go do all these different things, to the point where like even some of the work of George Washington was done completely out of coffee and tea houses during some of the American Revolution. Like tea was an important social structure. It'd be like being taxed for Wi-Fi today. We would not be happy with that. They were not happy with the tax on tea then. Anyway, so tea is by far the most drank beverage in the world. It's made by steeping tea leaves into boiling or warm water. This may be consumed either hot or cold, and there's many different types of tea, right? There's oolong, Doras, there's Sumatra, there's Java tea, which is not the same as Java coffee. We have lots of different types of tea throughout the entire world. Okay. So we also have other types of flavored drinks, right? So Coca-Cola and Pepsi have long dominated the market, and this is true throughout the world at this point. For a while, I actually was helping out a Coca-Cola plant in Africa, which was really cool, mostly to see how they dealt with like cleaning water and reusing bottles and developing some of those systems. And it was really, really neat. So anyways, Coca-Cola and Pepsi have long dominated the market. That doesn't mean that there's not other sodas in the world, but these are by far the most largely distributed and biggest companies related into the soda industry that produce, I think, like 14 of the 15 most drank sodas in the world. In the 1970s, that's where we started to get diet colas. These were ones that were not as sugar-based, but instead were focused on being able to have different things that might have a lower calorie count. Then we also had in the United States, we have really high sugar taxes. That's why Coca-Cola in the United States tastes different than how it tastes everywhere else in the world. It's because we use corn syrup as opposed to sugar because of the high import taxes on sugar. Unless it's like during Passover and the Coca-Colas with the yellow tops on top, those are made with actual sugar and not corn syrup. It's because it's better for the Jewish community and can go along with what their needs are. So I just think that that's kind of cool. Anyway, so in the 1970s, we started to have the rise of diet sodas. They now account for about 10% of sales of sodas across the world. We also have things such as like energy drinks and beverages. So Coca-Cola and Pepsi, for the most part, are caffeinated. They do have non-caffeinated alternatives. Energy drinks and beverages that are designed to give consumers burst of energies using caffeine, B vitamins, and different herbal ingredients. These became very popular after the introduction of like 5-Hour Energy and Red Bull in the early 2000s and is now huge. We also have juices and juice bars. I don't know if y'all have noticed the like rise of juice bars lately, but it's been huge. And it's a place where people go for a non-alcoholic beverage that's actually kind of healthy for you, where you can get like different shots, which is basically just like 1.5 ounces of different types of juices that are made from different things to give you different wellness properties. Anyways, juice bars are becoming a relatively new development. They're specializing in quick, healthy drinks that are trying to also serve the function of a social center. Especially with Gen Z, we've seen like the lowest rate of drinking in among different sort of groups, right? Like Gen X and boomers, they are the booming generations drink a lot heavily or more heavily than millennials, kind of drink a little less. Gen Z drinks a little bit less. So with that, you've had like the sober curious group. And with the different sober curious groups, this has really changed the hospitality industry on how we approach being able to flavor drinks and thinking about people who might be more health conscious. And that's where we've had this rise in juices and juice bars. Jamba Juice was like not a thing in the 1980s, right? So these were a huge change to the market and how we've had to approach hospitality. We also have bottled water. So bottled water is very popular within Europe, especially in places that may not have safe drinking water. Back to what I was saying all the way at the beginning of thinking about wine is why did we have the earliest creations of wine 3,000 years ago? Well, it's because water wasn't always safe to drink. Turns out water is not always safe to drink even today, especially in many different developing countries and in different parts of Europe. So bottled water has been very popular in these areas and in turn has grown in both the US markets and developing country markets. Okay, so let's think a little bit about bar setup, right? Like the physical bar. When we go into hospitality and tourism, you'll notice that most restaurants have a bar somewhere. A lot of this is to be able to help control the flow of customers. So you have a place for if your dining area is completely full, a place for people to rest or relax or talk or be able to have something to encourage their appetite before eating. We also have places that are just specifically bars. For the purpose of people wanting to come drink. Or we have places such as like juice bars, what I was just talking about, or oxygen bars, which have the same sort of like table format where you have someone who is a bartender who can provide services to you and communication to you while you are having this particular type of beverage or whatever it is in the case of an oxygen bar. I still haven't been to an oxygen bar. I'm not quite sure what those are, but they sound neat. They're in a bunch of airports now. So anyways, the physical bar setup is critical success from allowing hospitality workers to be able to reach supplies efficiently. Like if you had to go walk 20 paces and then 20 paces back every time you want to use a specific item, that would be outrageously bad for efficiency. And it would get your steps in, but you'd be mad at the end of the day. Your feet would hurt and you would not be a happy camper, right? So being able to have things where people can efficiently grab them, like this physical setup, is actually really important. And with this, we also need to think about inventory controls. So how much fruit is in the fruit tray? How much of the well alcohols of each type are available, and how quickly can we access them? Because how often do our customers ask for that particular thing? So safeguarding company assets and providing reliable accounting records and promoting operational efficiency and adhering to company policies, these are really important from an inventory control status. Also, back to sometimes alcohol is the most abused resource within different hospitality industries. So you want to make sure that like all of your inventory is there and controlled for. This also means that you don't have people making too strong or too weak of drinks, right? Because if you have too strong of a drink, this might cause someone to become too intoxicated and unable to operate motor vehicles or get home safely, or they might be in danger of their health. And that's not good. That's not good. There might be underpouring where people are not actually getting what they're paying for. So having some sort of inventory control system allows you to understand what the existing inventory is. And you typically do this on a weekly or monthly basis where people go in, they'll just count everything in the bar. And the purpose of this is being able to make sure that there is consistent service and consistent products. Technology is really improved, especially with beverage management. So we have things such as like Scan a Bar now, where you might have within a restaurant, they'll have like one specific phone that you just go and you like scan all the bottles, and it'll tell you like how much is still in there, how much has been used, compare it to the number of drinks that you sold to see if like those kind of add up or not. You also have different tops that can go on the top of different alcohol bottles that will measure the pour coming out to make sure that you pour exactly the right amount each time, or will tell you if there's been a lot of overpouring coming out of those particular bottles. That's just kind of interesting and neat because we've had a lot of technology come in to be able to try to standardize something that was often an abused practice, right? So these sort of beverage operations can account for the ounces sold of different sorts of alcoholic beverages on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. Oh, so let's think about restaurant, hotel, bars. These are ones in which the bar is not necessarily the main piece. It's a stop point to be able for some people to be able to sit at and eat at, but most of the time a stop point to be able to control the flow, so we don't overwhelm the servers in the area in which food and dining is happening, right? So a bar in a restaurant can be used as a holding area to be able to manage the flow of guests. This prevents kitchens from getting backed up with too many orders, and also alcohol is very shelf stable. It's one of the few things in a restaurant that you can actually have sit there for a few years. Most things that are going to be in your kitchen, that is not the case for, right? So it's something that you can have a steady inventory of and not worry about that inventory going bad very quickly. Beverages will generally account for 25 to 30% of total sales for a restaurant that does have a bar within it. And in some places, you'll hear if this is a call alcohol or a well alcohol. A well package is sort of like your least expensive alcohol. So most cocktails that are ordered within that bar will be made from the alcohol that's sitting within the well. So basically in a place that's easy to grab from. And they're used to be able to count out your pours. You put them back, and then you serve that cocktail to the guest of the restaurant or hotel, right? So these are typically your least expensive brands. Then we have the call package. These are typically the ones that are like really pretty behind the bar. They might be on risers or something. They're there for display because they tend to be more expensive. They're also in the group of spirits that the bar offers to guests who ask for more expensive brands. The total sales of the restaurant itself typically have a pour cost of between 16 and 20%. Now, not all bars are within restaurants and hotels. We also have things such as like nightclubs. Nightclubs are places that have like music and social environments, and they're more reliant on alcohol sales. So they typically don't serve food. They might have a charge for an entrance fee, but besides that, alcohol is their main generating revenue source. We also have places called brew pubs and microbreweries. These have absolutely scaled up in the past 20 years. We did not have the rise of craft beers today, or 20 years ago, that we do today with, I think we have 3 different breweries in Morgantown alone. Morgantown, which has 25,000 people when the students aren't here. Like that's just a wildly high number. They offer a variety of different sorts of styles and flavors of beers, many of which are made in-house, which is why you're able to go there for places like to give a tour and to learn about the equipment. We also have places called sports bars. So these typically have food and alcoholic beverage, but the way that they are able to attract customers is through paying for different satellite television coverage of top sporting events, right? Oh. So owners, managers, bartenders, and servers may be liable on the law if they serve alcohol to minors. That's a big no-no. If someone's under the age of 21 and you serve them alcohol, even if you are in the hospitality industry and you are working for a company, it's not only your company getting in trouble, it's not only your manager getting in trouble, it is you getting in trouble. You can lose your ability to serve alcohol at all. You could be fired. You could go to jail. You could get very large fines. And also to people who are intoxicated. So this is something that has become very important to think about, especially as we have like dram shop laws and things governing sort of the sale of alcoholic beverages, is the fact that a place or a restaurant or a bar or anywhere else can lose their license to be able to sell alcohol if they sell to people who are very, very intoxicated and might be in danger of harming themselves or of having bad health outcomes. So there's a huge amount of responsibility that comes in the hospitality industry of having some sort of bar management within your field. Now, there's lots of trends happening right now. Cocktails went out of popularity for a while and people were just drinking straight spirits or they would drink wine, but now we're seeing kind of like a comeback of cocktails, many of which that are lower alcohol volumes. So this is for a lot of the sober curious crowd, or which is just kind of how it's been talked about in the newspapers a lot. So that's the main terminology I'm going to go for is what I see in the Wall Street Journal. But there's many that are like lower alcohol volumes for people who may not want to be as heavily intoxicated, or they might just want a lower alcohol drink, right? Or no alcohol drink. We've also seen a lot of designer bottled water. 15, 20 years ago, if you went to the gas station, you could get like Dasani and maybe whatever the cheap brand was, and that was it, right? Now we have lots of designer water coming out. So you have Voss, you have different ones that have different stories behind them. The one where like the little bottle has a little fish. I don't even know what that is, but it's pretty. I always thought it's cool, but it's way out of my price range. I think it's called Smart Water. So we have designer water bottles, we have microbreweries. Those are growing tremendously. That is a huge change that we've seen in the field. We've also seen increased marketing of beverages to consumption by women. So back in the 1940s and 1950s, a majority of alcohol advertisements were geared specifically towards men. We've seen a huge shift away from that as we've gotten to the 21st century. We've also seen a variety of energy drinks to the point where I think Coca-Cola has their own coffee brand now, and Pepsi has their own coffee brand, and they also both have energy drinks that they're producing. Like the rise of energy drinks has been huge. It's no longer just Red Bull and Monster like it was 15 years ago. Like there's an entire process to it. So that's sort of the stuff that's happening in the beverage world. And that kind of just gives you your huge overview of like, these are the main things that we're talking about in beverage hospitality. If you have any additional questions, let me know. But from there, I'm going to go ahead and stop this video so you can jump to the next one where we start to talk about restaurants. All righty.